Good morning. Glad you made it. If you happen to be visiting this morning or you're relatively new to ABC, welcome. We're really glad you're here. We would love to meet you if we haven't already. Be out there at the Connect booth. Actually, I won't be, but we have our Connections class finishing up this morning, so I'm going to run off to that after this. But we have a couple of our team members out there. Would love to get you some information about our church and help you connect in a meaningful way. If you're looking for that, as usual, you can fill out the green card there. And if you're just looking for some info, put a note on there and we'll get back to you. And always, we love praying over those prayer requests. And so there's a spot there on the back for prayer requests if you'd like to share that as well. If you're watching online this morning, thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you back here on campus real soon. But we're grateful you get to stay with us through the technology that we have these days. We're in Exodus chapter 33 this morning. Let me catch you up real quick in case you haven't been tracking. We just had this scene a week ago where Moses comes down from the hill. He's up on the hill receiving some clear direction from God himself. So God is giving him laws and a kind of a covenant agreement on these stone tablets. And if you remember the story, Moses comes down from the mountain and he finds the people of Israel worshiping what? A golden calf, which is the weirdest thing. We talked about that last week, but so odd that they would have made an image of a cow and they're worshiping it. So Moses is furious. He enters into this bantering relationship or this bantering conversation with God where he's basically saying, hey, don't destroy the people. I know they messed up, but these are your people, remember, and what you promised to do for them and with them. And remember, this is your name on the line. So he has this conversation back and forth with God, ultimately petitioning and saying, please don't kill the people. And God relents. So God says, okay, fine. I don't know if he actually said that, but he probably did. Okay, fine, Moses. And then in Exodus chapter 33, the most interesting and peculiar thing happens. At the very beginning of the chapter, God says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to send you up to the promised land and pave the way for you and fulfill everything that I promised I would do for the people of Israel. And I think Moses is kind of like, really? Like no heavy hand, fist, punitive action. God says, I'm going to give you everything I promised I was going to give you, but I'm not going with you. And it's like this bomb gets dropped in the conversation between Moses and God because for the people of Israel, the presence of God was everything. The presence of the Creator God, Yahweh, in the midst of Israel meant so much to them that ultimately what they said was, no, we're not going without you. Which is so surprising. So if it's me, you guys, if I'm in the scene, in the midst of Israel, and I hear, I'm going to deliver you to the promised land, I'm like, finally, we've been praying for that. We've been asking for that. Take us out of the desert. Take us to the promised land. I'm already back at my tent. I'm rolling up my bed. I'm packing my bags, load up the burro or whatever it was that I had ready to go. Take me to the promised land. I'm in. And yet in verse 4, here's what they say. Exodus 33, verse 4, when the people heard this disastrous word, they mourned. And no one put on his ornaments. Again, I'm like, guys, what are you waiting for? The promised land. Did you hear what he said? They're mourning. All I would have heard was milk and honey. And all they heard was, I'm not going with you. And for some reason, that was life-changing for them. For some reason, that was a deal breaker for them. The people of Israel in the desert halt. They stop, they take off their jewelry, they mourn, and essentially say, if he's not going with us, then we're not going. Which is crazy if you think about Israel choosing between the blessing of God and the presence of God, and they choose the presence. That's crazy. But that's what they do. They are forced in Exodus chapter 33 to choose between the blessing of God and the presence of God. And Israel chooses the presence. This is one of those rare moments in Israel's history, if we walk through the Old Testament, where I think we would do well to actually emulate what Israel does. Not often. There's a lot of times, golden calf incident included. There's a lot of times when they're like, don't do what they did. Don't follow Israel's pattern. But in this case, I think we would do very well to look at their response, to ask, why did they respond the way that they did, and to emulate it. If you and I had to choose between the presence of God and the blessing of God, what would we choose? The people of Israel choose presence. It's almost like an instinctive reaction, like they don't have to think about it. It's just almost like a second nature kind of reaction, because they understood that his presence, his blessing was nothing without his presence. But I think here's the problem for you and I is I don't know that we often distinguish the blessing of God from the presence of God. So often those two are synonymous. In our life, we kind of equate the blessing of God with the presence of God, that we receive so many blessings and we believe that the blessings are coming through his presence, or maybe we think that his presence is coming through his blessing. That so often those things seem connected, that we experience the favor of God, maybe his provision, maybe that's opportunity, maybe that's material, maybe that's relational. I don't know what that might be for you, but you experience the favor of God, and at times we equate that with the presence, just naturally. And yet these two things were very different for Israel, so I think we would do well to understand why they're making such a distinction about the presence of God. So look with me in Exodus chapter 33. And I'm going to read the first 16 verses, and then we'll come back and finish the chapter at the end. But let me just read this, and if you've got your Bible, follow along. Process through what's happening in the scene and the sequence of conversation and how this is all playing out as you consider the fact that God has given them a very clear directive. Exodus 33, verse 1. And the Lord said to Moses, "Depart, go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt, to the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your offspring I will give it. I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanites and the Amorites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go up among you, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people." When the people heard this disastrous word, they mourned, and no one put on his ornaments. For the Lord had said to Moses, "Say to the people of Israel, you are a stiff-necked people, for if for a single moment I should go up among you, I would consume you. So now take off your ornaments, that I may know what to do with you." Therefore the people of Israel stripped themselves of the ornaments from Mount Horeb onward. So here's what's happening is God's saying, I'm so frustrated about this dynamic in which you chose to worship a different God, that there's this righteous anger God has. We talked about it last week in Exodus 32. There's a righteous indignation that God has toward his people, that he says, I'm not going to go with you, but I'm going to fulfill my promise because that's who I am. I'm going to make good on the things that I said I would do, but I'm not going with you because I fear that if I go with you, I'm going to destroy you. And rightfully so, again, as we talked about that last week. So in verse 4 it continues, verse 7, it continues. Now Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside the camp. Now, this is almost like an addendum. So we have like a narrative. Here's God talking to the people of Israel through Moses and this dialogue exchange. And Moses like tucks this little appendix in here. He's like, just remember what used to happen. Now Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside the camp, far off from the camp. And he called it the tent of meeting. And everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. Whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people would rise up and each would stand at his tent door and watch Moses until he had gone into the tent. When Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. And when all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, all the people would rise up and worship each at his tent door. Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. When Moses turned again into the camp, his assistant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from the tent. Do you see what Moses is doing here? He's listing this dialogue, this exchange between he and God. And he drops the bomb. God says he's not going with us. And then he adds this little parenthetic story about how God used to meet with Moses at this tent of meeting outside where his presence would be experienced in fullness. His presence would descend on the tent, and all the people of Israel would come out of their tents and they would stand by their doors and they would worship him. And while they were worshiping him, Moses would speak as a friend face to face with God. He's saying, remember how God's presence was so profound, how it meant so much. Remember how the presence of God changed the air, changed the atmosphere. How good it was to be in the presence of God. And then he continues on with the dialogue story after this little sidebar. Verse 12, Moses said to the Lord, "See, you say to me, bring up this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight. Now, therefore, if I have found favor in your sight," love how Moses argues with God. He's got such a good tactic. "If I have found favor in your sight, please show me your ways, that I may know you in order to find favor in your sight. Consider too that this nation is your people." And he said, this is God's response, listen. And he said, "Okay, fine." No, it doesn't say that. And he said, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." And he said to him, "If your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not in your going with us so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth?" God relents and agrees to go with the people of Israel up to the promised land. Just a beautiful picture. But I want to break it down for a minute because I think beyond the fact that Moses argues with God and gets his way, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, there's some kind of distinct understanding of the presence of God that Moses and the people of Israel have that I think we're missing this morning. And we do very, very well to glean from them. And I think it has to do with their understanding of the presence of God. Their experience of the presence of God. So let's just look for a few minutes. What was the experience of the people of Israel of the presence of God? Why was it so unique and so special that they would choose presence over blessing? So let's break that down for a few minutes. So first, the presence of God for the people of Israel is rest. Go back and look at verse 14. God says, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." He's coupling rest with presence in the same sentence here, which happens multiple times before, that the rest of God comes with the presence of God, and the presence of God brings the rest of God. And as I read this line, and I just simply see God saying in these simple 5 words, "I will give you rest," my mind is piqued. My memory is recalled of a similar verse in Matthew chapter 11 where Jesus says something very, very similar where he says, "And you will find rest for your souls." Do you remember that line? And I start to realize this is a definition of the presence of God, that rest is a fair way to describe and define the presence of God, that when we enter into the presence of God, we actually enter into rest. Or in Psalm chapter 23 where David says, "He leads me beside still waters, he restores my soul." That the rest of God, the presence of God is actually restorative. That it's good for my soul. Do you have those people in your life, or one of those people, whose presence alone brings this kind of peaceful rest? Maybe you haven't recognized it until they were gone. You know, or then they're gone and you realize, gosh, I think their presence was like this stabilizing, peaceful force in our lives, or maybe even our homes. My grandfather was like that. When we were at his house and he was home, there was just this rest, this calming presence that comes over the home. It's just take a deep breath. Everything's going to be okay. He had this soft-spoken, gentle voice, but spoke with firm clarity that provided this rest. And I have to assume, because of the the on-ramp to getting to Exodus 33, where we've come from, that rest is supposed to be associated with Sabbath in this case. So when God says, I'll give you rest, when you're going to have rest in the presence of God, it, I think, needs to come through the practice and the discipline of Sabbath. As we look at the previous chapters, that becomes very, very clear that God's intention to give the people rest by his presence was to come via their disciplined approach toward the Sabbath. The rest of God offered his presence. And ultimately, it was only found in abstaining from work for 6 days, and then rest on the seventh. I have this mental picture in my mind, particularly thinking of Psalm 23, lead me beside still waters. I have this picture in my mind where there's like a meadow and it's just a perfect day. The sun is shining and there's just this gentle breeze, but there's no wind and little birds are chirping. And I come through this meadow on a nice, warm, quiet day and find a little stream. And as I walk up to the stream, I can't help but notice a brook trout down in there staring back up at me, just waiting to be caught. And so I enter into a battle in that moment where fishing turns into a broken line, which turns into wet feet, which turns into fingertips bleeding from hooks getting jabbed, and my hands smelling like power bait for the next 3 days, and end the day empty-handed and tired, and say to God in frustration, God, where is the quiet water rest for my soul in this moment? And God simply responds back to me and says, it was beside the water, not in the water. That I would have stopped short of the water, which is so difficult for me to do. That I would find rest for my soul by stopping just short of the bank of that little stream and experiencing the rest of God with intentionality. Michael Burr says it this way. He's a professor from Dallas Theological Seminary. He says, Jesus identified the Sabbath as a time of rest when God's people can experience his presence and celebrate their redemption. That with an intentional pause, a seventh day stop, you could experience the presence of God and celebrate your redemption. The presence of God comes in rest, and the rest of God brings the presence of God. It's this circular process that as we experience presence, we experience rest, and as we experience rest, we experience presence. It's a win-win, guys. It's the bottom line. God's presence brings rest. Secondly, God's presence identifies his people. In verse 16, it says, for how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not in your going with us, so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth? Such a peculiar line of argument, if you think about it. What makes us, God, is you. If we are not called children of the living God, then who? We're not going to go experience the blessing of God. We're not going to go with the identity disanchoring by leaving us behind. God, we're going to only go with you. So they're so identified with Yahweh that it would have been a crisis of identity for them should he not go with them. God, we don't want to go apart from you. And honestly, I think one of the great tactics of the enemy that you and I battle with today as 21st century Christians, one of the greatest struggles we have is that there are a lot of other ways for us to answer this question. The we don't know who we are question isn't a problem for us. We could answer it with a whole host of other answers. We could answer it through relationships or through parenthood or through hobby or through gender or through career, you name it. We could find something to identify with. We don't have a problem coming up with a name to associate with our identity, and yet the people of Israel had no other option. Who are we if not yours? We're not going to go without you because we identify with you. And unfortunately, I think in the day that we live in, we will identify with nearly anything else besides identifying with the Creator God, Yahweh, the sustainer of all life. May the protest of the Israel people in Exodus chapter 33 be a lesson for us that their call to God, their plea to God, don't Don't make us go without you, for we don't know who we are apart from you. May that become a lesson for us in understanding our own anchoring identity in the personhood of Yahweh, of God, and of Jesus Christ. Paul writes this letter to the church in Galatia to help them kind of understand the gravity of their identity dynamic. In chapter 4, verse 4, he says, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God." What a beautiful description of our identity. That we would understand this in the fullness of Israel, that they could understand they're no one without God. That we would read this passage and say, I'm a son, I'm a daughter of God, and I'm no one apart from that. If I don't have the presence of God, then who am I? Such a beautiful understanding of the fullness and the richness of our identity found in God himself, our creator. When Jesus says, you must become like a child, I just wonder if he meant more than the innocence or maybe the ignorance of children. We kind of typically will read that verse. Oh, we got to kind of become blissfully ignorant the way children are blissfully ignorant. That's kind of a way to say we must become innocent and simple like children are innocent and simple. I wonder if what Jesus meant was you must become like a child of God, called by his name. That he would speak your name and you would identify and associate your life and your entire story with him and not with all these other things. There's a worship leader friend of mine, his name's Tommy Walker. Years ago, wrote a song called He Knows My Name. If some of you remember, it's really old. I brought it up in our meeting the other day and everyone looked at me like I was crazy. And I remembered that I'm old, but anyway, he wrote this song. He was over on a mission trip in the Philippines and working in an orphanage. Tommy goes in to work amongst these kids and he meets a little boy named Jerry who's 7 years old. And 7-year-old Jerry comes up to Tommy and he says, "Are you my friend?" And Tommy says, "Yeah, I'm your friend." And he says, "What's my name?" And Tommy says, "Your name is Jerry." And he goes, "Okay." And then like 2 hours later, Jerry comes back to Tommy and he says, "What's my name?" And Tommy says, "Your name is Jerry." Okay. And then the next day, Tommy comes back to the orphanage and 7-year-old Jerry comes up to Tommy and he says, "Hey, what's my name?" And Tommy says, "Your name is Jerry." Okay. See, this little boy never had anyone who knew, remembered, and spoke his name. He was so hungry to be known that when we have everything else stripped away from us like a child, the one thing we need is someone to tell us what our name is. The one thing we need is for the creator of the universe, Yahweh, the sustainer of heaven and earth, to say, your name is child of God, son or daughter of the king of the universe. Don't forget that. And so for Moses to argue back, say, God, who are we if not yours? You can't not go with us. You can't leave us here. We're no one without you. They understood the identity that they had with God. God's presence identifies. And thirdly, God's presence is pleasing. Look at verse 17. In fact, let me just read the rest of the passage here. If you've got your Bible open, there's just a few verses left in chapter 33. Let me finish the passage and we'll circle back on the last couple points. And the Lord said to Moses, "This very thing that you have spoken, I will do for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name." Moses said, "Please show me your glory." And he said, "I will make all my goodness pass before you and will proclaim before you my name, the Lord. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious and will show mercy on whom I will show mercy." But he said, "You cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live." And the Lord said, "Behold, there's a place by me where you shall stand on the rock. And while my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I've passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen. So as this conversation concludes, God first says, you have found favor. Verse 17, you have found favor in my sight. I am pleased with you, Moses. The presence of God, the conversational relationship Moses has with God is pleasing to God, and it's pleasing to him. Moses' plea to God, go with us, Lord, prove your favor to us, is responded by the Creator God saying, okay, you've found favor. He wants to be wanted. Now, don't get the wrong idea that God is some kind of insecure celestial being that needs the little peons of the earth to want him because he wants to be desired. That's not the case at all. Remember what God did at the very beginning is he created man, humanity, all of mankind, to enjoy God. The purpose of man was to enjoy a relationship with him. So naturally, it's fair for him to desire his creation to do the thing that he created it to do, which was to entertain a conversation, to entertain a relationship, to have this face-to-face interaction, the presence of God. God designed us and made us for his presence in order that we could enjoy it and he could enjoy it. It's very simple. There's a really cool conversation that takes place in 2 Chronicles. I don't have time to really give you the whole backstory. You could go read it. But there's a king. His name is Asa. He's a good king. And Asa is making his way all through Judah, and he's wiping out all of these foreign altars. So Israel had, again, no surprise, defiled themselves by worshiping false gods. And so they built these altars where they were called incense altars, where they were basically offering incense to all these foreign gods. And Asa is making his way through and basically saying, we're going to be God's people. We're not going to be these foreigners' people. So let's get rid of all the things. And there's a prophet that ends up coming to speak some encouragement to him. His name is Azariah. And as Azariah comes to Asa, he defines what's happening in such a clear way that I think is helpful for us in experiencing the presence of God. So in 2 Chronicles 15, verse 2, Azariah says to Asa, the Lord is with you while you are with him. If you seek him, he will be found by you. He's essentially saying, stay the course, Asa. What you're doing is good and pure, and pursuing a relationship with God, pursuing this presence of God by wiping out foreign idols is a good thing. And as you pursue God, you're going to experience him. And then he says in verse 4, for a long time Israel was without the true God and without the teaching priest and without the law, but when in their distress they turned to the Lord, the God of Israel, and sought him, he was found by them. God is waiting for us to desire and to step towards him and to experience the presence of God. In this case, Israel was missing out. They were wandering, much like they were with the golden calf incident. They were looking for their identity in a plethora of other things. And yet when they, quote unquote, came to their senses and realized we are God's people. We're not anyone else's people, but God's. And God's presence was favorable to them. His presence was pleasing. John Piper wrote a book called When I Don't Desire God. Really helpful because he basically takes on this question of, but what if I don't want the presence of God? Then what do I do? And he outlines in 300 pages or whatever, like John Piper does, a couple of simple terms in order to pursue the presence of God. But here's the summary. What he says is the problem is not our knowledge of God. The problem is our desire. So he says, if our chief end is to glorify God, the great object, we do so most fully when we treasure him. We learn to value him. When we desire him. When we delight in him. So supremely that we let goods and kindred go and display his love to the poor and to the lost. He's saying you desire God so much that you would let the blessing of God, the good and kindred, go. You would let the promised land go, the way Israel is basically saying, we're not going to take the promised land if it's not with you. We want the presence of God more than the blessing of God. That we would let those things go in order that we could pursue the face of God and experience the presence of God in such a profound way that he could continue defining who we are and continue to see favor upon us. God's presence, not just his blessing, are pleasing to us, or should be pleasing to us, and he's pleased with us as we enter in to his presence. And finally, in verse 15, we find that the presence in Moses' terms is essential. It's not an option. In verse 15, he says to him, "If your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here." Moses, again, arguing with God, we're not going if you're not going. Not going to do it. This stubborn, indignant Moses continues to face off. As Gerald said last week, are you allowed to talk to God like that? I don't know, Moses is. And he responds favorably. You go back down to 17 and God says, okay, you found favor in my sight. This is what I'll do. I'm going to go with you. God relents again. Way to go, Moses. So here's the most fascinating thing about the whole sequence, though. If you read the entire dialogue and you realize Moses seems to get his way with God relatively quickly. Maybe it's his debate tactics. I don't know. But Moses gets his way. So now he's in this scene, God, quote unquote, got God right where he wants him, right? I got you. You're giving me everything I want. So now that I've got your attention, now that you're responding favorably, I'm going to ask you for the moon. And he does. Again, I put myself in Moses' shoes and I'm like, man, God just keeps giving me this and this and this, everything. We're not going to do that. We're not going to, hey, don't kill the people. Okay, I'm not going to kill the people. Hey, don't make us go without you. Okay, I'm not going to make you go without. God is responding to Moses and he's like, okay, seems like I can get whatever I want from God. So here's the ask. Listen to this, verse 18. Please show me your glory. Not what I would have asked. Right? Like he's about ready to take him up to the promised land. So I'm thinking, okay, like a chariot escort would be great. Like a culinary artist to cook some meals along the way would be really nice. Like the weather, this arid desert's like kind of a pain. So maybe just some nice cool mist while we're going. In fact, if I didn't have to walk, that'd be great. Could someone carry me? Maybe you could just deliver us to the promised land so we don't even have to walk. I would have asked for so many other blessings from God. And Moses gets right to this point and he comes up to this negotiating climax and he says, okay, show me your glory. And this becomes such a clear indication of Moses' understanding, superior to you and I believe. A superior understanding of the presence of God, that this is what he would ask for. Show me your glory. I've seen your presence. We're experiencing your presence. You're saying you're going to go with me. You're going to say you're going to go with us. We're going to find favor in you. Okay, so let's go. Show me your glory. And again, God responds favorably. And we see this pinnacle moment for Moses to experience the presence of God. And this dialogue goes on where he says, well, you can't see my face because no one can see my face and die. So I'm going to show you my glory, but I'll just let you see my backside as I pass through. I'm going to hide you in the cleft of the rock so you don't die. God orchestrates and arranges this scene so that Moses gets what he wants. He experiences the presence of God in a more profound way than I believe any other human being since has seen the glory. Maybe on the hill of transfiguration, maybe Peter, James, and John experienced some of that glory the way that Moses did. I'm not sure, but I think other than that, there is no other human experience that could transcend Moses' picture, Moses' embrace of the presence of God. And again, it begs the question, do you want the presence of God or just his blessing? Is that how much you long for the presence of God? And so there's a tension for us as I read this and process through the dialogue. And the tension is, how could I desire the presence of God when I have an experience like Moses? It's not fair. He gets to see the Shekinah glory, right? He gets to sit on the hill and watch the power of God. Of course he desires the presence more. So it's up to us then to learn and to glean from what he saw and what he experienced, and to allow these words, the truth of Scripture, to sink into our hearts and to begin growing and fostering this hunger and this desire for us to look at a story like this and say, I want that. I want what Moses has. Show me your glory, God. Show me your presence. Let me experience it that way. I think our experience is imbalanced, is the bottom line. That we have so often experienced the blessing of God, and we equate that to the presence of God, that we really don't know what we're looking for when we talk about the presence of God. And we don't have a Sinai, last time I checked, where there's earthquakes and fire and clouds descending on hills, and you could feel the ground shake as his presence is demonstrated to our fearless leader Moses. We don't have that available. So then what? And then how? Let me just leave you with a couple of very quick steps to experience the presence of God, if you will. If it's possible to put steps to something like that. There's a little leaflet book written by a guy named Brother Lawrence. And Brother Lawrence was a monk in a monastery where he essentially was the commissary. He was a bus boy, dish boy, clean the house kind of guy. And he wrote this, but this book is actually just a collection of letters. Some of the letters are written by him as he experiences the presence of God. Some of them are written of others observing his life and listening to what he said in order to describe what it meant to experience the presence of God. You could go read, it's a real short little book, probably read it in like 2 hours. But let me summarize, because I know that a lot of you aren't going to go read it based on the blank stares when I say that. Let me give you the 5 points of summary that are at the end of the book. He says, here's some ways that you could improve your experience of the presence of God. First, salvation. Maybe seems like a no-brainer, but kind of an important concept. If you've never embraced a faith in Jesus Christ, if you've never looked to Jesus as the forgiveness for your sin and said, He is my Lord, He is my Savior, He's forgiven my sin, and therefore has allowed for me to enter into a relationship with God, then you cannot experience the fullness of the presence of God. That's the first step. Salvation becomes essential. And if you need to hear more about that, I'd love to talk to you after the service about salvation and what that means. Secondly, he says, practice love. In the vein of the letters that John writes, the Apostle John, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, in the vein of those letters, we love because he first loved us. You love God, or you love others, and as you love with the love of God, you begin to experience the presence of God in a more full and complete way. The second thing is loving others, practicing love. The third thing is checking your heart's desire, which means asking regularly, do I really want the presence of God, or do I just want and desire his blessing? Is my heart actually desiring experience of God, desiring presence of God, or is it just desiring the material goods that I get from following him? Fourth, use short phrases, he says. Simply saying hello, or good morning, Lord, or I love you, God, or thank you for being here, or could you please remind me that you are here now? Do you know anybody that talks like this? I've met some people where throughout their day they're kind of saying, I know, God, you're here with me right now. Would you please show me your presence? I need you to demonstrate your love to me right now because I'm not feeling very known or loved right now. That there's these short little phrases you could pray periodically throughout the day that would begin this conversational dialogue that would help you to experience the presence in a more profound way throughout the day. And the fifth thing he says is look for God at work in the smallest of circumstances. This guy was known, Brother Lawrence was known for doing the dishes. He'd sit there at the dish sink and just be praying, God, help me to see your glory in this menial task, this small work. Help me to grow in my love for others as I do this. Help me to serve and understand while I'm serving. Help me to see Jesus in the painful moments. Maybe it becomes a prayer in those hard and difficult moments. Jesus, are you present in this painful moment? Can you show me where and how you're working right now? Because I don't see it. Or Father, can you anchor my wandering mind? I'm distracted and I need you to help me focus. Or Lord, can you just remind me that I'm loved? Can you remind me what my name is? Can you just be Jerry for a minute and say, what's my name? Can you just remind me what my name is? And with these 5 things, a growing rhythm of relationship and experiencing the presence of God can begin to define our daily reality as opposed to these one-time monumental moments. We often speak of them as mountaintop experiences, and that's really what we're saying is we experience the presence of God and then we leave that mountaintop and long for the next time. So let this fill in the gaps between the mountaintop moments that we'd begin to experience the presence of God so much so that we could grow in our desire for his presence over our desire for his blessing. That would be a miracle for me. If I grew and I so desired the presence of God more than his blessing, the way that Israel did in this scene. If we had to choose between blessing and presence, which would we choose? We see Israel choose presence. We're going to sing a song in a minute. I'm going to pray and the band's going to join me here. And the song says this, a beautiful prayer. It says, we will seek your face before we seek your hand. We desire you before the promised land. Sometimes with worship songs like this, it's sort of easy just to kind of go through the words or let the band sing them. This is a really helpful prayer, and it may not be true of you today, and that's okay. Don't let that keep you from singing it. In other words, I think we can sing these prayers with an aspirational desire that it would become true of us. You might read that and say, but that's not true of me. I don't desire you more than the promised land. Say this prayer that it ultimately may grow in your heart and become a truth and an expression of how you would move towards him as you desire his presence more than his hand of blessing. Father, thank you for just a clear decision that Israel made in this passage this morning and a clear example, a way for us to follow and model what they're doing here, which isn't always the case. And so we're grateful. Thank you that you ordained this story to be in this book. For whatever reason, God, you tucked these little dialogue conversations between you and Moses right here in Exodus so we could examine them now, look back on them and ask, how should we respond? How should we talk to God? How should we desire God the way that Moses and the Israelites desired God? Shape us by these words and make these statements true for us, that we desire your face. We long for your face before your blessing. In your name I pray. Amen.